an underlying structure in American history, largely misunderstood, operates not as a shadowy conspiracy, but as a documented system for wealth extraction spanning over 100 years. This mechanism functions as follows. The American populace conceives of technological advancements, which are then financed by the government using taxpayer funds. Subsequently, a select cadre of well-connected individuals privatizes these innovations, amassing fortunes in the process, while the public, who initially funded the development, receives no benefit. Similarly, the United States military engages in conflicts not for genuine national security, but for the pecuniary gain of corporations. $8 trillion have been expended, resulting in the loss of 7,000 American soldiers' lives and millions of civilian casualties, with the same small circle of defense contractors profiting to the tune of $2 trillion. Furthermore, the American dollar, a creation of the people, has been under the control of a private banking cartel since 1913. This cartel manipulates the money supply, engenders inflation, and profits from public indebtedness. In the event of systemic collapse, these same entities are recapitalized with taxpayer money, while ordinary citizens face the depletion of their savings. This is not theoretical speculation. It is a reality substantiated by verifiable names, dates, financial figures, and official government records, charting the systematic depletion of American wealth. This investigation delves into who orchestrated this, their methods, and the ultimate destination of this wealth. Part 1 examines the conflicts that drained America. From 2001 to 2024, the United States allocated $8 trillion towards the global war on terror, encompassing operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan. This immense sum represents taxpayer and borrowed money, a financial burden that will burden generations to come. The outcomes for America have been largely negative. Iraq was found to possess no weapons of mass destruction, rendering the premise for the war a documented falsehood. Afghanistan capitulated to the Taliban in 2021, marking a 20-year, $2.3 trillion defeat. Libya has devolved into a failed state with extant slave markets. Syria is presently under the influence of Russia and Iran. Yemen is controlled by Iranian-backed militias. In essence, none of these conflicts resulted in victory for the United States. Rather, they exacerbated existing problems. The human cost is staggering. 7,000 American soldiers perished. Over 30,000 were wounded, and an estimated 1 million civilians lost their lives across these nations, all at a cost of $8 trillion. The beneficiaries of this expenditure were not America, its soldiers, or its civilians, but the defense contractors. Between 2001 and 2021, the top 5 defense contractors secured $2.1 trillion in government contracts. Lockheed Martin alone received $550 billion, Boeing $380 billion, Raytheon $320 billion, General Dynamics $280 billion, and Northrop Grumman $270 billion. Collectively, these 5 corporations reaped over $2 trillion from the war on terror, witnessing their stock values triple and their executives achieve billionaire status. The question then arises, who were these executives, who sat on their boards, and who actively lobbied Congress to perpetuate these conflicts? Dick Cheney, vice president under George W. Bush, previously served as CEO of Halliburton, a defense contractor. Upon his ascension to vice president in 2001, Halliburton's government contracts stood at $1.2 billion. By 2003, following the commencement of the Iraq War, this figure had surged to $39.5 billion, an increase of $39 billion. Cheney's personal holdings in Halliburton, including stock options, were valued at $8 million when he assumed office as vice president. By 2005, this valuation had escalated to $34 million. Cheney personally profited from the Iraq War, a fact recorded in public documents. Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush, served on the board of ABB, a company involved in nuclear reactor technology, and Gilead Sciences, a pharmaceutical firm that manufactured Tamiflu. Prior to his tenure as Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld advocated for increased military spending. Following his departure from public office, the defense contractor stocks he held experienced an appreciation exceeding $30 million. Robert Gates, who served as Secretary of Defense under both Presidents Bush and Obama, joined the board of Parker Aerospace and Beal, both defense contractors, after leaving government service. He amassed millions from the very companies whose contracts he had previously overseen. This phenomenon, known as the revolving door, describes the seamless transition of government officials into lucrative positions within the defense industry as board members or lobbyists, a practice that, while legal, perpetuates a cycle of influence. Lobbying records are publicly accessible. Between 2001 and 2021, defense contractors invested $2.5 billion in lobbying efforts directed at Congress. Lockheed Martin spent $209 million, Boeing $185 million, and Raytheon $147 million. This documented expenditure is aimed at securing greater military appropriations, to which Congress invariably responds with increased defense budgets. Subsequently, members of Congress, upon leaving office, frequently assume positions on the boards of these defense contractors. Senator Joe Lieberman, who advocated for the Iraq War, joined the boards of multiple defense contractors after leaving the Senate, earning millions in the process. General James Mattis, Secretary of Defense under President Trump, previously served on the board of General Dynamics, a defense contractor, and rejoined such boards after leaving his governmental role. General Lloyd Austin, the current Secretary of Defense, was a board member of Raytheon prior to his appointment, earning $7 million from the company in a single year. He now presides over contracts awarded to Raytheon. This system is intentionally structured, operating not as outright corruption in the legal sense, but as a well-established mechanism. The process involves defense contractors lobbying Congress, which then increases the military budget, leading to the awarding of contracts to these same companies. Executives reap substantial financial rewards, and in turn, they and their board members contribute to congressional campaigns. Upon retirement from public service, members of Congress often join the boards of defense contractors, perpetuating the cycle. This has been operative for 70 years. President Eisenhower cautioned against such a development in his 1961 farewell address, explicitly warning of the military-industrial complex and the undue influence exerted by the defense industry and military establishment. Since that pronouncement, this intricate system has only grown more entrenched. The Iraq War alone incurred a cost of $2.4 trillion. According to Brown University's Costs of War project, no weapons of mass destruction were ever discovered. The war was initiated based on deceptive intelligence, reportedly influenced by Vice President Cheney's office, as documented by the Senate Intelligence Committee. The Downing Street memo from 2002 revealed that intelligence was being manipulated to serve a predetermined policy favoring war. This is a matter of established fact, not conjecture. Individuals making critical decisions regarding warfare profited immensely, while American soldiers perished, families were devastated, and the national debt doubled. Part 2 addresses the banking system that ensnares America. In November of 1910, 7 individuals convened for a clandestine meeting on Jekyll Island, Georgia. These individuals represented the preeminent banking institutions of America and Europe, including J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and the Rothschild banking families, alongside Kuhn, Loeb, and Co. Their objective was to devise the framework for the Federal Reserve System. This event is extensively documented, notably in G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which draws upon primary source materials. The attendees utilized assumed names and traveled separately to conceal their identities and the purpose of their gathering. The reason for this secrecy was their intent to establish a private banking cartel that would exert control over America's monetary supply, a plan they knew would incite public outrage if revealed. The 7 individuals were Senator Nelson Aldrich, maternal grandfather to Nelson Rockefeller and a representative of Rockefeller's banking interests, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank and a liaison for Rockefeller and Loeb interests, Henry Davidson, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan Company, Charles Norton, president of First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust, Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn, Loeb & Co., and a representative of the Rothschild banking family, and A. Piatt Andrew, assistant secretary of the Treasury. These 7 individuals collectively represented an estimated quarter of the world's wealth. They spent 9 days formulating the Federal Reserve Act. They presented this legislation as a governmental reform intended to avert banking crises, such as the Panic of 1907. This was a deliberate misrepresentation. The Federal Reserve Act was conceived to centralize monetary control within private hands, enable unrestricted money creation, render the government dependent on private banks, and guarantee that banks would receive taxpayer-funded bailouts in the event of failure. The act was enacted on December 23, 1913. At the time of its passage, a significant portion of Congress was absent for the Christmas holiday, with only a handful of members present. President Woodrow Wilson subsequently signed the legislation into law. Years later, Wilson reportedly expressed profound regret, stating, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country." This sentiment is a documented part of his writings in The New Freedom. The Federal Reserve is not a federal entity. It is a privately held corporation owned by private banks. Its principal shareholders include J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Bank of America. These banks hold the power to elect the members of the Federal Reserve Board. Notably, Congress has never conducted a comprehensive audit of the Federal Reserve, which operates largely in secrecy. The institution generates money ex nihilo and extends it to the government as loans bearing interest. Consequently, every dollar in circulation represents a debt owed to the Federal Reserve System. The United States currently carries a national debt of $36 trillion. The Federal Reserve holds $5.2 trillion of this debt. Foreign governments hold $8 trillion, and the remainder is held by private banks and investors. The annual interest payments alone amount to $1 trillion. This interest accrues to bondholders, comprising private banks and member banks of the Federal Reserve. The operational mechanism is as follows. When the government requires funds, the Treasury issues bonds. The Federal Reserve then purchases these bonds by electronically creating money, which is effectively money printing. The government disbuses this money, leading to increased inflation as more dollars pursue a static quantity of goods, thereby diminishing the value of individual dollars. Banks that own shares in the Federal Reserve profit through interest received on the bonds and dividends distributed by the Federal Reserve. In 2022 alone, the Federal Reserve distributed $76 billion in dividends to its member banks, representing profits derived from a governmental institution that creates money out of thin air. When the financial system experiences a downturn, as it did in 2008, who receives the bailouts? The banks do. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, TAP, provided $700 billion in assistance, supplemented by $4.5 trillion in emergency lending from the Federal Reserve, and an additional $16 trillion in undisclosed loans revealed by a limited Federal Reserve audit in 2011, initiated by Senator Bernie Sanders. This audit exposed $16 trillion in loans extended to banks between 2007 and 2008. Specific recipients included Bank of America with $1.3 trillion, Citigroup with $2.5 trillion, Morgan Stanley with $2 trillion, and Goldman Sachs with $800 billion. These loans were issued at near zero interest rates. The banks then utilized this capital to acquire treasury bonds, yielding 3 to 4% interest, effectively generating risk-free profits. Concurrently, millions of American homeowners face foreclosure, with 9 million families losing their homes. The individuals responsible for precipitating the crisis received financial lifelines, while the victims received no recourse. Part 3 examines the appropriation of technology. The Internet originated from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, with funding provided by taxpayers. During the 1960s and 70s, the Department of Defense invested billions in the development of ARPANET, the precursor to the Internet. This represented public expenditure on public research and the establishment of public infrastructure. In 1989, Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN, created the World Wide Web. He made this invention accessible and free, placing it in the public domain. Subsequently, private corporations commercialized this technology. Companies such as Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft built vast empires upon technologies that the public had funded the development of. Jeff Bezos now boasts a net worth of $170 billion, Mark Zuckerberg $120 billion, and Larry Page and Sergey Brin each over $100 billion. These individuals did not invent the foundational technologies, rather they commercialized public infrastructure and, in many cases, pay minimal taxes. Amazon, for instance, paid no federal taxes in 2018 despite generating $11 billion in profit. Google strategically shifts its profits to Ireland and Bermuda to circumvent U.S. taxation. Apple maintains over $200 billion in offshore accounts to avoid tax liabilities. Global Positioning System, GPS technology, developed by the U.S. military over 2 decades, cost $12 billion in taxpayer funds and was made freely available in 1983. Subsequently, private enterprises leveraged this technology to build businesses like Uber, Lyft, Google Maps, and Waze. These companies are collectively valued in the hundreds of billions of dollars. They did not develop GPS. They capitalized on publicly funded technology. Touchscreen technology, initially invented by E. A. Johnson at the Royal Radar Establishment, was funded by government research and further refined through the contributions of CERN and universities with public investment. Apple did not invent the touchscreen. It commercialized it. The iPhone generates over $200 billion in annual revenue, and Apple's market valuation stands at $3 trillion, largely built upon publicly funded technological advancements. Pharmaceutical research also follows a similar pattern. The National Institutes of Health, NIH, allocates $45 billion annually to medical research, funded by public money. When a new drug is discovered, pharmaceutical companies license it and then charge exorbitant prices, often $100,000 per year, for medications that cost as little as $5 to manufacture. For example, a hepatitis C cure that costs approximately $5 per pill to produce is sold by Gilead at $1,000 per pill, translating to $84,000 for a complete treatment regimen. The foundational research was publicly funded, while the profits are privatized. The cancer drug Keytruda, developed based on NIH research and manufactured by Merck, costs $150,000 annually. Merck generated $20 billion from Keytruda in 2022. The NIH research enabling its development was publicly funded. Similarly, COVID-19 vaccines benefited from Operation Warp Speed, which provided $18 billion in public funding. Pfizer reported $37 billion in profit from its COVID-19 vaccine in 2021, while Moderna earned $18 billion. Both vaccines were developed with substantial public investment, yet the profits were privatized. The recurring pattern is as follows. The American people fund research through taxation, universities and government laboratories develop technologies, and private corporations then license or acquire these innovations at minimal cost. They subsequently patent these technologies, establish monopolies, and dictate their own prices, amassing billions or trillions in profits. Through the strategic relocation of profits to offshore tax havens, they minimize their tax obligations. Consequently, wealth generated through public investment is captured by private entities who, in turn, fail to reinvest in the very systems that facilitated their prosperity. This is a legally sanctioned process, a functioning system. Patent law permits companies to monopolize publicly funded research for 2 decades. Tax law enables corporations to shift profits to tax havens. Trade law allows companies to manufacture goods overseas, where labor costs are lower. The American populace bears the cost of innovation, while corporations reap the value, and executives achieve billionaire status, leaving the nation financially diminished. Part 4 investigates the disposition of wealth. In 1980, the wealthiest 1% of Americans owned 23% of the nation's wealth. Today, that figure stands at 34%. In 1980, the wealthiest 0.1% held 10% of the wealth. Currently, they possess 20%. The top 1% has accumulated $30 trillion in wealth since 1980, while the bottom 50% has experienced a net loss of $900 billion, according to Federal Reserve data. Between 1980 and 2020, worker productivity increased by 62%, while wages, adjusted for inflation, rose by only 17%. This disparity between productivity gains and wage increases amounts to $47 trillion, wealth generated by workers that has been appropriated by owners and executives. Where has this wealth gone? It has primarily flowed into executive compensation. In 1965, the average CEO earned 21 times the income of an average worker. Today, CEOs earn an average of 351 times that of the average worker, often justified as maximizing shareholder value. From 1980 to 2020, corporations funneled $10 trillion into stock buybacks, a practice that primarily benefits executives and wealthy shareholders, not the workforce. Additionally, between $8 and $36 trillion in wealth is held in offshore tax havens. The United States loses an estimated $180 billion annually in tax revenue due to offshore tax evasion. Consider specific illustrations. The Walton family, with a net worth of $247 billion, presides over Walmart. Walmart's notoriously low wages necessitate taxpayer subsidies amounting to $6.2 billion annually through programs like food stamps and Medicaid. The Waltons extract wealth from America, offer poverty wages, compel the government to subsidize their employees, and, through complex trust structures, avoid paying over $3 billion in estate taxes. Jeff Bezos, with a net worth of $170 billion, saw Amazon pay zero federal taxes in 2018. Bezos himself pays a lower effective tax rate than his secretary, primarily through stock-based compensation and loans secured against his stock holdings. He has acquired significant assets, including the Washington Post and vast tracts of farmland, and is investing in a space exploration company using wealth derived from tax avoidance strategies. Elon Musk, with a net worth of $250 billion, has seen Tesla and SpaceX receive over $5 billion in government subsidies and contracts. Public funds have been instrumental in propelling Musk to become the world's wealthiest individual. He minimizes his income tax liabilities by taking loans against his stock and has relocated Tesla's headquarters to Texas to evade California taxes. Furthermore, he actively opposes unionization to maintain low labor costs. Private equity firms such as Blackstone, KKR, Apollo, and Carlyle Group have a documented history of acquiring American companies, burdening them with excessive debt, extracting cash through dividends, and ultimately driving them into bankruptcy. Iconic brands like Toys R Us, Sears, and Payless have fallen victim to this model, resulting in the destruction of thousands of American businesses and the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs. Executives orchestrating these private equity deals have amassed billions. The leadership of Carlyle Group has included former President George H.W. Bush, former Prime Minister John Major, and former Secretary of State James Baker. These individuals have accumulated hundreds of millions through private equity ventures, leveraging government connections and utilizing debt to acquire companies, extract value, and leave a trail of bankruptcy. This outflow of wealth extends beyond domestic transactions. Chinese manufacturing, for instance, is where Apple assembles its iPhones with profits subsequently retained in Ireland, resulting in minimal U.S. tax contributions and the loss of American jobs, thereby transferring wealth to China and Ireland. The petrodollar system, which mandates that oil be traded in U.S. dollars, has led to Saudi Arabia accumulating over $700 billion. This wealth has been invested in U.S. assets, including real estate, companies, and infrastructure, effectively meaning that money Americans spent on oil has flowed back to Saudi royals, who then purchase American entities. European and U.S. banks have collectively paid over $300 billion in fraud-related fines since 2008, yet they persist and continue to profit, with a significant portion of their earnings held in European tax havens like Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. Part 5 identifies the key individuals behind this systemic structure. This analysis focuses not on ethnic or religious affiliations, but on specific individuals who wielded positions of power and exploited them for personal enrichment, all of which is documented in public records. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State from 1973 to 1977, was instrumental in negotiating the petrodollar agreement with Saudi Arabia in 1974. Following his departure from public service, he founded Kissinger Associates, a consulting firm that served clients including Saudi Arabia, China, major banks, and oil companies, earning him tens of millions by advising the very nations with whom he had negotiated as Secretary of State. Alan Greenspan, Chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1987 to 2006, oversaw a period of financial deregulation that contributed to the 2008 crisis. After leaving the Federal Reserve, he became a consultant for Deutsche Bank, PIMCO, and Paulson & Co., earning millions by advising hedge funds on Federal Reserve policy, a system he helped shape. Ben Bernanke, Federal Reserve Chairman from 2006 to 2014, presided over $4.5 trillion in money printing and bank bailouts. Upon leaving the Federal Reserve, he became an advisor to the Citadel Hedge Fund, receiving over $300,000 annually, and served as an advisor to the PIMCO Bond Fund, commanding speaking fees of $250,000 per engagement, thus profiting from the very policies he implemented. Larry Summers, Secretary of the Treasury under President Clinton, championed banking deregulation, including the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act under his tenure, which enabled banks to become too big to fail. After leaving the Treasury Department, he earned over $20 million in 1 year from hedge fund consulting and speaking engagements. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase since 2005, has led a bank that received $25 billion in bailout funds in 2008. Although repaid, the bank extensively utilized Federal Reserve lending facilities. Dimon's net worth increased from $500 million to $2 billion during and in the aftermath of the financial crisis. His bank has paid over $40 billion in fines for fraudulent activities, yet no individuals faced criminal prosecution. Lloyd Blankfein, CEO of Goldman Sachs from 2006 to 2018, oversaw a firm that received $10 billion in bailout funds. Goldman Sachs secretly engaged in betting against the very mortgage securities it sold to its clients, an act of fraud that resulted in a $5 billion fine. Blankfein's compensation during the crisis included $68 million in 2007 alone. He retired with a net worth exceeding $1 billion. Robert Rubin, Secretary of the Treasury under President Clinton, advocated for banking deregulation. After leaving the Treasury, he became vice chairman of Citigroup, earning $126 million over 8 years at the institution. Citigroup received $45 billion in bailout funds, along with over $300 billion in guarantees. Rubin profited from the deregulation he had championed. Timothy Geithner, Secretary of the Treasury from 2009 to 2013, managed the bank bailouts. Upon leaving the Treasury, he became president of the private equity firm Warburg Pincus, accumulating millions. In the same week he departed from government service, he joined a firm that invests in distressed assets, assets that had become distressed as a consequence of the crisis he had managed. Henry Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury from 2008 to 2009, was formerly the CEO of Goldman Sachs. During the financial crisis, he ensured Goldman Sachs' survival while Lehman Brothers failed, effectively saving his former company. Paulson's Goldman Sachs stock, valued at $700 million when he became Treasury Secretary, was a significant asset. After leaving office, he returned to banking advisory and consulting, earning millions. These are individuals with identifiable names who held influential positions and whose documented conflicts of interest are clear. They do not represent a clandestine organization, but rather a network of powerful actors operating within a defined system. Certain individuals transition between public service and the private sector, having enacted policies that serve their own interests and those of their allies, accumulating considerable fortunes as a result. The interconnectedness between financial hubs like Wall Street and governmental centers in Washington is a well-established phenomenon. Since 1990, a substantial 70% of officials within the Treasury Department have either originated from or returned to positions at firms on Wall Street. This dynamic fosters an environment where governmental strategies inevitably favor financial institutions, as the very individuals formulating these policies are themselves industry insiders. Part 6 delves into the outflow of wealth towards China and beyond. From the year 2000 to 2020, the United States experienced a loss of 5 million jobs in the manufacturing sector, with 65,000 factories ceasing operations. The destination of these lost jobs and closed facilities was primarily China. The architects of this shift were corporate leaders motivated by the pursuit of lower labor costs, alongside trade policy architects who facilitated these moves. This intricate system was intentionally constructed. Trade pacts such as NAFTA and China's accession to the WTO were actively promoted through corporate lobbying efforts. Initial assurances suggested these agreements would benefit American workers. However, this proved to be a falsehood, as the true beneficiaries were corporate profits. Prominent figures like Robert Rubin and Lawrence Summers, along with other Treasury officials, were instrumental in advocating for China's entry into the WTO in 2001. They predicted a balanced trade relationship, a prediction that proved inaccurate. The imbalance in trade widened dramatically, leading to the severe decline of American manufacturing. Meanwhile, the officials who championed these policies saw their personal fortunes soar. Rubin amassed $126 million at Citigroup, while Summers earned over $20 million through consulting for hedge funds. Their personal prosperity contrasted sharply with America's national decline. In conclusion, the depletion of America's resources was not attributable to a singular entity, but rather to a comprehensive system. This system involved a network of individuals embedded within government, banking, defense industries, and corporations who leveraged their positions to siphon off wealth. These same individuals orchestrated military interventions that cost $8 trillion and resulted in thousands of fatalities, while defense contractors reaped $2 trillion in profits. They established a financial framework in 1913 that empowered private banks to generate currency and profit from public debt. Furthermore, they appropriated publicly funded technological advancements, including the Internet, GPS, and medical research, subsequently privatizing them and amassing trillions in wealth while minimizing their tax obligations. They facilitated the relocation of American jobs overseas, decimated domestic manufacturing, and directed wealth to China and offshore tax havens. This phenomenon is not rooted in racial or religious affiliations, but rather represents a distinct social stratum, a financial and political elite whose movements are fluid between Wall Street, Washington, and corporate boardrooms. The identities of these individuals are publicly known, and their financial transactions are meticulously documented. The system operates within legal parameters, which is precisely the core of the issue. This is not a clandestine plot, but a functional system deliberately designed to extract wealth from America and consolidate it among a select group of a few hundred individuals who exert control over banking, defense, technology, and trade policy. The nation's wealth is no longer predominantly held within American borders. Instead, it resides in offshore accounts, Chinese manufacturing facilities, Irish tax havens, and Saudi Arabian investment funds. The American populace, responsible for generating this wealth, serving in wars, and bearing the tax burden, has received little in return. Conversely, the elite who made these strategic decisions have accumulated billions. This narrative is substantiated by names, figures, and official government records. The crucial question is not whether these events have occurred, but rather what actions will be taken in response.